Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you had a great day yesterday and you're ready for a great day today. We have another full schedule of, we hope to be fascinating presentations, plus a few awards and announcements. Our first speaker, our next keynote, her staff sent a formal biography that I could read, and I'm not going to. And instead, I'm going to share with you her relationship with CERIAS and Purdue, at least a little bit of it, because I think it's interesting. In 1991, I believe it was, maybe in 1990, a colleague of ours, who many of you have met if you've been in the field for a while, Becky Bass, was organizing some workshops on security and invited a number of people who were involved in academic security at the time, including me and Carl Levitt, who was at UC Davis as a faculty member. And we brought along several of our students to these workshops. And I don't quite remember whether it was held in Albuquerque or out in California. It was in Albuquerque, and our students were there. We introduced some of our students to each other. And one of the things Carl happened to note is, I've got this really good student, and she's going to be graduating soon. We'll be looking for a faculty position. Keep an eye on her. And I thought, okay, if I hear that from Carl, who really knows what he's doing, I ought to do that. So I had a conversation with a young lady who was getting ready to leave, and she had some very interesting things to say about her research, and was looking for a faculty position. It sounded perfect because we needed some more faculty in security at Purdue. She submitted her application. We had discussions. I don't remember quite the extent of them, but what I do remember is that along the way, she had to make a very difficult decision. She wanted to pick a university where she could go and do great research and work with great colleagues and students. Purdue met that. But it had to be a place where she could bring her horses. Sorry. We didn't quite rank highly enough in that category. Interestingly, she is the second faculty member in a 5-year period where I had the same response for not getting a faculty member here. So this is one thing that if there's anybody from the administration listening, we need to have perhaps stables, a livery on campus. And I'm not referring to some of the dorms, which are close. Instead, she went to the University of Idaho and founded the Academic Security Research Center there, built up courses, programs, attracted students, was one of the first 7 centers of academic excellence, so we continued to encounter each other there. And in 1999, how many of you ever heard of the RAID conference? A few of you here. It's the Research Advances in Intrusion Detection. It's considered to be probably the top conference in that area. The second RAID conference was held here at Purdue, was hosted by CERIAS. I was the general chair, and Deb was the program chair. So she supported that effort, and we had great fun with that. In the mid-2000s, 2004, she started at Pacific Northwest National Laboratories, national laboratory run for the Department of Energy, doing research, and worked her way up to become the chief cybersecurity scientist at PNNL. And then, about 4 years ago, moved to the Baltimore area, where she became a leader, first as Deputy Director of Research at the NSA, then the Commandant of the education program that the NSA runs, the Cyber College. Or, well, actually, it's more than cyber. It's a whole set of things, including languages and other kinds of skills. And recently became the Director of Research for the NSA, which is all the R&D that's done internally and externally to support the nation's mission. And she'll tell you more about that, more about the field. I could tell you more about her. She's absolutely fantastic, has done so many things for the field, for us, for the nation, and she'll do more this morning. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Deborah Frincke.
Now, see, that's a scary intro because how am I going to over-deliver with that? And thank you for not telling those other stories because, as you can tell, I've known Spaff for a very long time. Probably the reason that I was even thinking about a faculty position in the first place was an early stage conversation. He's been a mentor to so many in the field. And CERIAS itself has been an extraordinary resource for the field as well. So before I start, I want to say I am so delighted to be here and so honored to be your second keynote. The things that have been done for the nation by your graduates are superb. We are safer as a country because of the kinds of people that you produce. And one of the pieces that I most value is that you both combine the technology and also the broader thinking, the cultural thinking. And for anyone who's read the papers lately, the cultural thinking, that understanding the broader concepts of what this country needs from its defense in all areas is crucial. And there are so very few places that go beyond specializing in one narrow lane. And this is one of those precious, precious few. So those of you who are students from Purdue, you are at a very special place. You have wonderful people here who have helped us. I just see lots of friends in the room. And I appreciate it. Now that I'm in my position, I see even more how important what you do is. So, and I will not tell you any Spaff stories because he would reciprocate. He's got more time today. So I will behave myself there and not go down that lane. But should he get out of line? All right, so how do I advance this? Is it right, left arrows? Yep. Okay. So I wanted to start, in fact, what I wanted to do today, let me tell you, I tweaked the talk a little bit, mainly because I was not able to be here yesterday for the fireside chat, and what I tend to value most from these talks is the conversational part, the questions that you ask. And one of the reasons that I'm doing so much public speaking as research director, and which I did earlier as commandant and then prior to that as deputy, is that I think that this is a stage in our country where the NSA has to do two things. One that it has historically not done at all, and that is to get out and talk to people. I have a business card. I am on LinkedIn. I show up with my name and my picture in places. I spoke in Doha and Qatar on unclassified cybersecurity and just about gave our security team heart failure when I said I wanted to do that. It took them 2 full months to decide that nothing bad was going to happen to the research director if she talked on a stage in Qatar. And nothing did. It was a great conversation. It was good for me. So I'm getting out there because I want to tell you more about ourselves, especially research. I also am out here, though, primarily because we need to do something that we're traditionally good at doing in other venues, and that's listening. We're at a crossroads, and I alluded to this in my mention of CERIAS, but we're at a crossroads in our nation's decision as to how we defend ourselves in terms of thinking through what our true objectives need to be, and most importantly, what we as a culture, we as a people, are willing to do to achieve those objectives. And these are issues we've been talking around in the field of cybersecurity for a long time, right? Privacy, information sharing, the ability, what do we design in, what do we not, what should be imposed, what should be voluntary. We've come to a point now where we have to, honest to goodness, step up to the plate and decide, because we are making decisions by default that are not going to take us to a place that we're happy with. So one of the key reasons I am here is for you to ask me tough questions that I probably can't answer so that I at least have heard those and can take them back. And I'll answer the ones that I can. So please, when we get to that stage, I've asked the front group, I sometimes spend a little too long on a slide. I'd like to spend at least half an hour giving you a chance to do Q&A. I'll be delighted if I can manage to pace myself to give you more time than that. Spaff, when am I supposed to be done? 9:45, all right. So we've got a little over an hour. We should have plenty of time for both those things. But that's part of my purpose for being here, is for us to have that conversation. I truly value that. And I take that back and talk about it with my colleagues, and interesting things can happen. So let me start with research. This is a picture of some of our facilities, but I want to give you a context for research at NSA. How many of you have been to our site, NSA in general? For quite a few. How many of those who've been there have worked with research or seen where we fit in? Just a handful. So research at NSA is like research in no other place that I've been. And as you heard from that bio, I really can't seem to, I get restless feet and I move from place to place. And so I've been to a lot of interesting places with startup companies, university time, time at a national lab, and now time here, both looking at research from education and also from the standpoint of leading it. And the reason that I say it's so different is that research is a core part of our decision-making process at NSA. We have a senior leadership team that works with the director directly, that meets, as you might expect, a couple of times a week, where we sit down and we talk about what's the most important in our area. Ourselves, we link sometimes with Cyber Command as well. Research is there at the table as one of 4 mission directorates. 1, the Information Assurance Directorate. 2, Signals Intelligence, dealing with that half of our mission. Technology Directorate that some of you work with. Research is the 4th. By far the smallest, and much less operational information. And then, of course, we have centers. But I wanted to highlight that for you because this is not a place where research is off in the corner, an afterthought, something that's unimportant to what we do, or that is thought of as lesser or the first place to cut. NSA realizes that in order to stay abreast of what the adversaries are actively seeking to do in terms of harm to our nation, that we need to stay on the cutting edge. And so because of that, I think it was probably 10 years ago, perhaps longer, research was elevated from an associate directorate that moves through the chief of staff as an enabler and thought of as a primary member of the NSA. Now that's a rather scary position to be in, I have to say. I did not realize that when I went to the agency as deputy director. And it means, though, that we have an opportunity, and those of your students who work with us, to come up with those ideas that can change where the agency goes. Because that's the whole point. The beauty of NSA research is that we're supposed to help invent a better future. And that means providing more options to our leadership in terms of how they can get the job done of securing a nation. So research at NSA, I want a takeaway for you, is a key part of the leadership, meaning that I share responsibility with my colleagues for good and bad, for the kinds of things you read about. And I'm putting that out there so you'll know you can ask the tough questions. I will answer them as research director, and if you have things that are not in my lane, I will find others to answer it. But I want to put myself out there a little bit more so you don't feel like you have to always just research. It's research. We invent the future. We give options, and we're at the table, so that's critical. The second thing, and I'll talk about that a little more later, is what the difference is between mission-oriented research and applied research and some of the general research you've seen, because that, again, is a nuance that we don't often see, but I want to tell you a little bit more about the kinds of organization that we have here first. So most of our people are located in research and engineering building. This is a nice change. My predecessor pulled this off. I do not know how he did that with all the red tape that we've got, but this is a wonderful facility, first of its kind. The building was pretty much bare ground when we raised it, and so research itself had input into the design here. We worked tightly with facilities, and while it may not seem to be a big deal to all of you with the wireless that you've got here, trust me, the fact that we've got both classified and unclassified wireless inside that site was heroic and is a first of its kind. So nowhere else in the intelligence community did we have this kind of access. Research led the way, and we've been visited by most of the other IC to try to figure out how we pulled that off in a safe way. The second thing we've got, again, not too glamorous for the students, and I had trouble getting excited at first till I saw the red tape that it took to pull it off, is an internet cafe on the outskirts. So always before at NSA, you've had to take your own personal device and keep it a fair distance from the facility, the classified portion. So even our unclassified wireless is not personal devices. We actually allow, and found ways to allow, unclassified devices right on our outskirts. So we are looking at the kinds of risk and benefit payoffs that some of you see, maybe a little bit later than some of you have, but we've got quite a lot at stake and people trying to push, of course, the boundaries to leverage that. And that's been pulled off as well. Those changes came about in our what we call living laboratory facility here as a direct result of our trusted systems group work across the enterprise, so with facilities, with a technology director, and so on. So eat your own dog food, we're working at that. And I will tell you that the technology is the easiest part of the process by far. The policies, even once you've figured out how to get it secure, that is the most trivial piece of it. It's not trivial, but it's the easiest. You can do that usually within a year. But the policy part, probably another year easily to try to get things up to the right sorts of standards in terms of assessment. So that's been an important part. Living laboratory, lots of in and out, mostly classified facility. We also were part of the team that assessed the Fitbits. I'm wearing one today. I was the first senior leadership team member to wear a Fitbit inside of our operations building during a conversation with the admiral that runs us. So that's another thing we're looking at. We have to look at how do you assess technologies, how do you make them safe, how do we make sure that as devices are miniaturized and come in our walls, that we have ways to ensure that they are exactly what's anticipated. When some of them, I don't know if you can even tell I'm wearing one, it's a little necklace here, it's underneath the necklace. So shocked a number of the security guards, they will not spot it physically, and the newer things coming will be even harder to find. So lots of changes inside of our walls there, thinking in a more modern way for ourselves, which is not to say cutting edge for your typical place. But the research itself that we use for the nation is extraordinary and quite cutting edge. The facilities need to be secure. Most of the work that's done there is focused on the trusted systems group that I mentioned. We have a very large body of computer scientists, massive amounts of analytics, machine learning, analysis. Some of the language work is done there. We have operationally oriented folks and mathematicians. We have some of the best mathematicians in the world. Very fascinating team there. So that's mainly what's in Emerson. You see a number of other laboratories as well. We are located across the nation, and I am hoping to spread that still further. I think that the agency needs to have a presence around the country so that people in the country can have a chance to work with us more directly for shorter periods of time, and so that we have a better sense of what the country thinks about the activities that we take. Right? Because you always learn more when you're talking informally, even than in a conversation such as what we can have in the room. But that said, we have a number of, We have a number of sites here. I wanted to point out the Laboratory for Physical Sciences. There I have chemists, I have physicists, I have high-end, high-performance computing people. We can work on chips. We have a clean room, one of the biggest. In fact, most of that facility is underground. The underground part is unclassified, believe it or not. We have cleared folks as well, but most of those are working in a separate place. But here we have, most summers, at least a few dozen postdocs who come in, many from University of Maryland, a number of faculty that have worked. We're going to expand back again to have a stronger presence in our clean rooms that will work together. And what we do is something that we've talked about much in this field, is you identify a classified problem, you identify a parallel on the outside, and then you turn loose the best minds to work it, so that when people are there, they know they're working with us, obviously, but they don't always know the entire use of the technology, and they're aware of that when they come in. And some outstanding and extraordinary developments are there. So that's an interesting way of collaborating, and I encourage you to think through that if you want to come work with us. Laboratory for Telecommunications Sciences is a little bit different. They're set up so we also have unclassified facilities. In their case, it's the upstairs in the big auditorium. That's where the unclassified work comes. So we have contractors that will come in the front door and going up to the top floor. We do a lot of work with the University of Maryland through telecommunications, working with their honors program, for instance. An Internet of Things house is in the top of that building, so that's kind of cool. And it's a place where we have scared more IC members than... It's a scary place, both in the classified and the unclassified, in terms of what the capacity of the adversary is, primarily when we look at the classified, but also on the unclass side, we have had more people come from overseas, and we said, let's tell you about the sensors that tend to get built in, just in terms of the garments that are sold nowadays, and so on, and how you can be tracked by things that you purchased randomly, and just run a wand across people, and they're often shocked at what showed up. And I'm not talking about adversarial implanted things, I'm just talking about what they bought off the shelf. So a lot of that goes on. A lot of that kind of work is looking at what is the real world like in terms of devices. So we do that in Lab for Telecommunications Sciences. And their communications is their specialty, so a broad cross-section, everything from electrical engineers on to your computer scientists. And they, again, do a range of both science, nearer-term science, and longer-term science. Obviously, the physics lab, most of the physical sciences will take longer. Some of those projects might be in the 10-year plus range, where they start as true basic research. A little less of that in the telecommunications sciences. Theirs tend to be more in the 2 to 3 year out, but some of it's up to 5. Center for Advanced Study of Language, you mentioned that we had that over in, when I was in education and training. I got an eye-opener when I went there, because it turns out there's something like 100 languages that we need to understand at any given time, and it changes which one is most important. So some days you might be able to get away with just one language area in a particular time, and then all of a sudden the world heats up and you've absolutely got to have a dozen. So a lot of what they do with the Advanced City of Language is to think through how quickly can you get people up to speed in another language. And I don't mean a second language, although we call it that, because many of the people that we have in our agency will speak 10 plus languages. We have some extraordinary language analysts who work at the very highest level of the understanding the language. Very critical, because if you are listening to something and you get it wrong because you miss the cultural nuance, very bad. I have to stop there, but you can just imagine. And bad for the country. So if you misunderstand something as adversarial when it's friendly, that's a bad thing. And if you think something's friendly when it's adversarial, that's also bad. So there's different kinds of type 1 and type 2 errors that one can make. We do other things there as well. This is where we have most of our cognitive scientists, who I've gradually been stealing over for the cyber side. So we think about what is it that makes it easier to ready the brain to understand languages. So we do a lot of brain training work. They work with fMRIs, tight relationship with the University of Maryland in that state. Most of those are not government contractors. Most of those are funded through the UARC that we have available. And I think that Purdue may participate in the UARC too on the language side. I'd have to go look. I saved the newest for last, and this is a model that I think is one that fits better with the modern times and as we expand across the country, and that's our new Laboratory for Analytic Sciences. And I was near them, not visiting them, but near them yesterday when I was in North Carolina. And what's unique about the Laboratory for Analytic Sciences is what we've done is right on a campus, in a building much like this, we have a floor that NSA encompasses, and the name is on the outside, Laboratory for Analytic Sciences. Everyone knows it's NSA inside, and it is a SCIF. So that means that we can do TSSCI information, certain number of compartments there. We have placed some of our mission people who are approved to work pieces of NSA mission in that space, working tightly with the local university to make sure, and our own folks, and the local community to make sure that's welcome and effective. I have researchers there. We're going from 5 up to probably 25 researchers by the end of the summer. So a lot of people, equivalent investment on the research side. Bringing faculty and students in, clearing some of our work, and this is a change I made this year, is I said, you know, you really need to have unclassified space. Most of the collaborations that are appropriate for academia are unclassified, I think. Some of you will want to get the clearances, but if we limit it to those that are willing to take on the clearance and the approval requirements, we've hurt your career. And so that's something I'm personally very sensitive to, and we will not take you in if you're headed towards a career where that would be bad for you. You're sorry. You will have to find someone else that will help you endanger yourself that way. I would not find that ethical. But so there are some people that do, and they understand the problem space, but most are unclassified. And I like that because what that lets us do is integrate tightly with the community. And it's important both for the community and for my folks, because what's happening, and I'm seeing this, and it's wonderful, is that as our mission people and as our researchers engage with the students and faculty, sitting outside in the sun with their laptops, working on problem spaces, they get an entirely different sense of what it means to do research. Much more what you're used to here. That free-form collaboration, that peer review scrub, little less polite sometimes, but often getting at the heart of a matter, critical. And so that's been good for research, and it's also good for mission because it reminds them of what the real world is like. I said that with my outside voice, didn't I? All right. I could talk about this for all day, and I promise I will stop. There we go. Okay. So I wanted to put this one up next as a reminder to talk to you about the difference between mission-oriented research and applied research. Because when I first went there and I said, all of our research needs to work, people said, oh, so you do applied research. No. We do that and. So on the yes side, there are research emergencies. So I have been asked, Deb, you need to immediately deploy some of your researchers here, overseas perhaps, or to solve a particular problem. And we absolutely have to have that theorem by tomorrow or by tonight. I never thought in my career I would hear that. We've got to have this algorithm by tomorrow. It's almost like Scotty. The engines will blow. Their minds are heating up. The mathematicians can't go any faster, sir. But that happens. That happens. It's just the first time someone said that. They said it with a straight face, and they meant it. I just broke up. You're kidding me. That happens, that happens. But most of our work is not that way. We do have people working shoulder to shoulder with mission that are doing research emergencies in their space. We do get those calls. But most of our work is that 2-year to 10-year out. And what I mean by mission-oriented is that ultimately everything we do needs to inform or support a role of the agency. And so, but that's a very broad set of definitions. So some of it goes to support the technologies that we use in the operations and providing those options. Some of it is the work in formal methods and the work in science of security that's intended to help support the greater community. So by work, I mean that it's important to have those people that understand the basics or the advanced work that we do and can collaborate with us, or who have that knowledge and then who can go out freely into industry and share it. So that's an important part of what we do, and I would say we need to increase the balance of getting more out there, that if we can, to help seed the nation. It's not necessarily to lead it, but to seed it. So for instance, I put a toehold for in a couple of years, which is the best you can do with the budgeting process, to formally make science of privacy something that we invest in. Now, that's not an area I expect us to be the leader. I don't think we should be the leader. I think that should be led by outside, but we need to support and put out our perspective. So that's on the list. So we do long-term and short-term. We really do have people that will work on hard graph problems, really advanced cutting-edge mathematics, some physics that's extraordinary, and they might work it for 10 years. Not all of those things succeed, and they don't have to. This is a research organization. If we're not willing to take risk, then we're not doing research. So that would be very familiar to all of you. But just as those of you who are working on your dissertations realize, it's really nice if you have an actual positive result at the end of the day. And so we do take a careful look at what is our relative turnover, what is the ROI. So I have to wear my former industry hat when I think through what we do. Are we doing too much risk and not having enough of it turn into something that will change and support the mission? So when I talk about mission-oriented, I mean we're contributing to the mission, we have an eye on everything, but if it's going to take us 10 or 20 years to get there, that can be okay as long as it fits in with a balance. And as long as it doesn't become a self-licking ice cream cone. That's been a really key piece to make sure that we don't fall in love with a project and keep it. And one of the hardest problems in my job, probably top 10 list, is how to break loose a researcher either from research to follow their program as it becomes a mission program, or how to get them to give it away. And that is so hard, because there's always more you can do, and it's great. And you know when you hand it over, they're not going to love it like you do, and they're not going to add the features, and it'll be harder for you to work with the platform. And yes, so all those conversations that I've had with myself, I'm now having them with staff. But it's really important for us to let go of those things, because as we tell them, you can't invent the next future unless you let go of the current one. And sometimes that means people changing disciplines. So another thing that will happen, and this is perhaps even harder, although easier to make the call, is when industry has gotten better than we have in an area, or gotten good enough at something we don't need to invest. So I did have to kill a very excellent project this year. Didn't have to, but I can get just as good off the shelf now, partly because they did a good job of disseminating the technology. And so we shouldn't. We are a unique resource, the only large body of researchers in the intelligence community, and it's important for us to focus on only those things that only we can do. And so we have to let go. So that's part of the job too. And I'll talk a little bit about the needs of this organization, which is a sort of a artist rendition. It's not quite as pretty as that in some ways. It's almost as blue, though, I will tell you that. Okay, I talked about the research lab bit. I think I talked enough about research overview here, the kinds of things we do. So I wanted to launch into some of the questions, and these are things, they're not giving you an exhaustive list of what I care about in cyber, but I wanted to give you some of the things that I think are more controversial and also that I think are most important for us to be discussing as a community of researchers and as citizens of the United States. And in most of these cases, I will do my best to give you an example. In this case, I'm going to give you a personal example as opposed to a national security example, so that we can relate, I think, more carefully to the program than for me to say, bad security thing here, and we've got to share for it. Putting something into context that lets us talk about it is better. So to share or not to share information, in my view, this question is the key question that our generation needs to answer as cybersecurity researchers. If you cut through the fluff and the conversations and the angst externally, a lot of the problems that we have is because we don't understand yet what is it that we want to share with others and in what context. And who should control that? Or who should not control that? Who should see personal information and not? FISA court, different structure, no FISA court. Never share this kind of information, never monitor this information under any circumstances. Always monitor. What are other nations doing? What do we do ourselves as researchers? So let me personalize a little bit. I'll give you a couple of personal examples where I've had to face some difficult sharing decisions my own self, so that you'll know, again, we can get as sensitive as you like with the conversation. So, cancer survivor twice. Cancer number 1. 99, something like that. Yeah. So 99, diagnosis, stage 1, yuck. So gave up personal information to my colleagues to tell them that I needed to take some time out, gave up personal information to the doctors, and all of that was, in a sense, great because they used that information, the doctors and the colleagues. It could have been a very positive mentoring experience. Could have been, and that was the point of sharing. On the medical side, they saved my life. I'm here. Yay. I kind of like that. Some of you might enjoy that as well. So that worked, but it was at an expense. So I chose to share personal information for my own benefit in order to get better treatment from the medical community and in hopes, anticipation of better treatment from colleagues. And unfortunately, what sometimes discovers you can take a bit of a professional hit. It was not a career-ending injury by any extent. It actually raised me to a next level to deal with. But you take a bit of a hit. And I have another friend who's currently going through cancer as well, and she has chosen, partly because of observing that, to not tell her colleagues. So she's choosing not to share. She has that choice. The medical community, in terms of insurance, now there, you might say that the medical sharing was all a plus because, hey, here, I cannot buy external long-term care, even now. I can get health insurance even if I leave the federal government, but there was a time when my career was tied to those places that could give me medical care because I had shared information and was obliged to share that information. I couldn't just say to the insurance companies, oh, none of your business. Perfectly healthy. I get colds and one other thing. Don't want to tell you the other thing. I'll check every other box. Yeah. Not an option for me. So it restricted my career choices. I'm not unhappy with those career choices, but there were times when I had to think through, do I want to go with my startup company, for instance, my baby, when it left the research nest? And I couldn't. Not really, because if I got cancer again, who's going to take care of me? So you have to think about those things. That's important. And so the share or not to share, even when you look at extreme things like life, really matter. So cancer number 2. Because people had shared information about their cancer, all those required things with the pluses and minuses associated, much better options available. So very similar kind of cancer. That was 2 years ago. Still here. So it's all sort of working. The genetic information now that's shared gave us more tailored options for the treatment. So I was able to get more personalized results because of a sharing that had been forced that had a downside risk, but now I got to take myself advantage of that and did not have to have chemotherapy a second time. Yay. Very big thumbs up, quite happy about that. So the pluses and minuses of sharing, even in something like the medical field, we really have to think through. Because if my friend were forced to share information about her medical condition with her colleagues, she could face the same kinds of issues that I had early on. She could face some pretty significant problems when she's not healthy enough to deal with them. Others find that they get warm support for colleagues, so that's a case where we can argue for personal choice. Similar issues arise in national security. So when we think about what are we willing to share in this context, you need to step back. I would encourage you to step back and think through what are those bigger picture, those meta questions. And I would say we have not yet begun to ask ourselves those meta questions in a way we can analyze them outside the emotion and think through what is the rubric we would like to begin to use. And how much of that ought to be legislated, how much of it ought to be designed into our technology as options, and how much of it should be left to cultural sensitivity. And I don't have the answer for you there, and I should not impose a solution on you. That's why I put it out here for someone to use. So that's one of my biggies, sharing and not sharing. So apologies if that was too much information for you, but I did want you to be aware I do understand privacy and consequences. And there are other human beings at the agency who equally well understand that we all have lives, and there's some information you choose to share and some that you don't choose to share. And it hurts when someone takes that choice from you. And it can be harmful. And sometimes it can save your life or help your country. So, moving from that little note, off the soapbox. So here I want to kind of slap our profession on the wrist a little bit. I deliberately borrowed this slide from someone else and then tweaked a little bit. So on the left, what you'll see, when I said to one of our operational units, give me a slide that you use when you talk about what kinds of things you want to protect, and they gave me all these military things on the right-hand side. And then they drew on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side, you can almost tell by the font which they did and which I added. So they added in things like finance and power and gas and water and adversary. So when we think about defending those kinds of systems, you and I go back to the point where it's mostly DoD funded, and we had a particular target audience and user community in mind. We had one that could potentially be trained because they were hired by the organization that owned the thing that needed to be secured. So whether we were doing it by sending out good students that would be hired, they were going to be competent professionals, we hoped. Ethical, competent professionals that at least would have supervisors who would check on them throughout their lifespans. And so there's a certain kind of security remedy that you can prescribe in that area. And the organization could look at an ROI on security as well. You could think about insurance, you could think about designing in, you could put in requirements for buying parts, and so on and so on. And so all that was good. You could fire employees who didn't meet standards. You could hire them. You could find out that investing in training was a good thing. So all of that would work nicely if you look at many of these spaces in the, I like to say, the olden days. So I'm not firing grandma if she does a bad job with her Dropbox security. Not going to happen. And if the 5-year-old can't figure out what to do with the iPad and he figures out how to open it, though, and then clicks on some things, he's not going either. He's not mine, but so we're not going to fire anybody's grandkids or kids. People text while drunk. People set up bad security permissions on their homes, and sometimes they're forced into awkward situations where they need to either choose to have a technology that they desperately need at that moment or do without it. And so I've had to make what was a really, hated to make this decision, to get speakers at home that in fact were Bluetooth and you could read them outside the radius of the house for about 4 or 5 houses, but I absolutely had to have a way to monitor a certain situation for a while. And just to me, it was a life-threatening situation here versus one of my neighbors can read my Bluetooth, and so I went with the preserving life. So the things on the right, we make very different decisions than the things on the left. And the slap on the wrist to our profession is that we still tend to think, especially those of us who are classically trained, and I say this because I'm there too, we sometimes forget that the people on the right are all of us in the country, and not just those that are professionals, that are cognizant, that are working on a defined goal, who there's an ROI, who we can address in some kind of a lifelong learning from one standpoint. This is more of a cultural change. And so in our profession, while I don't foot stomp as hard as the to share and not to share, it's this mindset shift. And it's why I think so many of you who are coming to the field more recently, and also in a place like this that has a more diverse professoriate, have a better shot at it. And I suspect that CERIAS does a better job than most in terms of having the flexible viewpoint to the right because of that. But there's still a lot of institutions that I visit and papers that I read that really, I mean, truly you're going to expect the 5-year-old to make sure that that's been formally validated before he clicks on that app that's the Angry Birds update? Not happening. Or if he is, we want to hire that kid. So, I don't know. So this is an interesting change. I don't hear people talking about that as much. It's a generation gap in a way, and in a way not. I see a lot of our newer people that once we bring them in and we take all their tech away from them and make them work in those big buildings, that they start to take on the characteristics of those of us who've earned a little silver. I like to say I stay flexible by having about 12 gadgets to monitor when I leave. So that's a piece. This is another one I want to put forward, and the reason I'm giving you this slide again is I want to point out 2 or 3 things. When we think about cybersecurity nowadays, we think internally, we think about professional, we think about operationalizing, and in this case, 24/7. again, taking us away from the trickiness of the tech. In many ways, the trickiness of monitoring anything that's an emerging situation 24/7, whether we're looking at national security emerging issues or looking at cybersecurity attacks, either of those, whatever the range is, 24/7 means something about an individual. Any of you done shift work? I never had until I got there, and then I made it a point a few Thanksgivings to go in when I was back and forth between Idaho and wasn't visiting home. I would go in and spend some time with the folks and see what the mission was like. You get tired, don't you? At a certain stage, you start losing focus, and the mistakes that one can make in that situation can be hard. And if the screen and the display is monotonous, that's a problem. Or if it's too flashy, that's exhausting. So there are cognitive issues involved in the cybersecurity, and I don't mean usability. Usability is a different thing. I mean cognitive issues in terms of how people function over a course of time that we can learn a lot from in those areas that have studied operational issues. I rarely see this fed into cybersecurity solutions. Some of them have this intent person who's going to be just perfect in making every decision critically on the button for 12-hour shifts. Or they're thinking you're going to stay there. In some cases, you have to. But if you can, you don't want to have 24 hours of a team. Sometimes for continuity, you might need that with a team. But it's nice if you can give people a break. But when you're looking at monitoring lots of emerging situations, you like to have handoff. So the handoff between incident providers and getting someone up to speed, that could use a lot of investigation as well. So what are those key things about an incident? Some of that is local to ourselves, of course, but some of that ties to that larger issue of if you're going to protect something as large as a country from anything, whether it's a company or your home. I am not sitting like this at home, by the way. Not happening. You need to think through those cognitive issues, and you need to think about how do you keep people interested, and ideally you'll begin to predict in an anticipatory way when they're likely to begin making mistakes, a little like air traffic control, right? So a lot we can learn from that. And you see that in this picture, we are making both mistakes and good decisions with respect to keeping people entertained. And I do mean entertained because if your mind isn't entertained and engaged, it's not going to be as successful. And also some poor ones. Some of these displays are more aimed at a senior person walking in the room. And this is another thing I wanted to foot stomp about this slide. So we talked about the people, thinking about the displays and visibility. I worked in visualization and security for a long time. And I have to say, I didn't really grasp the differences between the audiences for different kinds of visualizations from the outside as I have on the inside. When our director wants to come in and see a security visualization, he's coming in as a director of NSA and the director of Cyber Command, and he's going to need to make a national caliber decision about a something, right? So what is it that you'd give to him? Now that's a very different picture than what do I give an operator who's involved in a particular facet of whatever that mission is or might be. And if you're trying to deal with a DDoS, for instance, I don't need the director to understand the IP addresses. He needs to understand the bigger picture of what's our confidence that A is doing to B, for instance. Is that the thing that we can block or not block? What are my options is what he usually wants to know. And so when he walks in, he needs to have something that will support his understanding and knowledge, and those that inform him need to as well, but yet the operators do too. And so that difference between the time frame and the individual's perspective is crucial. And we have had some papers that come out mostly from the visualization community, but they're just beginning to bleed a little bit into the cyber biz. That's a field I would say is maturing and could use some additional work. Good work's coming out, don't get me wrong. We're using a lot of visualizations here, but that's something to be thought of. Also, simpler is better. If it's complicated, again, thinking about shift work, those of you that did it probably tried not to do it for long periods of time. Nursing's one where you tend to stick with it, but most of us, you do your shift work and then you get out. So same for us, you don't really want to have more than a few year rotation here, and then you want to give them something different to do so they don't burn out. Also, they put a lot of food in those rooms. Just saying. So there's reasons. So that's the second thing I wanted to mention here. The third is compliance. A lot about that in the news, and so I wanted to raise it here as well. So not solutions for you, but there's a perspective I'd like you to take that can be hard. A lot of the crosstalk that I see about compliance when it's discussed inside of our agency and when it's discussed outside of our agency in the general population and when we discuss it at the national labs are really 2 to 3 different perspectives on that. So Nick, maybe close your ears a little bit. DOE national labs aren't really all that happy about being red teamed most of the time. And it's embarrassing when they find a way in, which they pretty much always can, because the adversary will just keep upping of their game, and this adversary. The delightful people that come to make sure that our DOE networks are always secure, they're going to find a way in, and sometimes it will seem very unfair. Well, that's a patch you wouldn't let us patch. We didn't know you were going to use social engineering on that one. Like, oh, oopsie, we just bought that computer. We didn't do the yada yada to it. So those things are not always seen as welcome. It's not seen as a partnership. It's seen as a low bar that needs to be met, and almost sometimes an impossible bar that needs to be met. I think that's fair. I won't put you any more on the spot than that. But that's about the sense that I had from the lab. So that's an issue. When I read the press and read comments from outside, I often see the thought of compliance as a thing that must be imposed on you because you would never, because you want to do that bad thing and we want to make sure you didn't. And I'm deliberately overstating it a bit because that's not everything, but it tends to be we have got to watch you like a hawk because we know that you're going to be stealing stuff. A little bit more like a theft from department stores is sometimes how it feels like. How would you make sure people can't steal stuff? So what's the third perspective? And those that fear the government, and sometimes rightfully so, some governments can't be trusted. You can step back to governments outside our walls and think of many examples. Sometimes you do have to take that perspective. So I'm not dissing that perspective at all. I'm also not dissing the national labs perspective of I'm not sure how valuable it is sometimes, even though sometimes it is as well. So those are very reasonable perspectives. But there is a third one. And this you can take as you like from someone who's been on the outside and has been on the inside. My colleagues are ethical people who are doing their level best to deal with extraordinarily complicated rules and regulations. And by and large, they make very few mistakes. And they do not like to make those. This is a culture where when they make a mistake, it's like that they want to report it. When I took on the role and I saw this firsthand, so when I took on the role of commandant of the school, one of the things I did is I visited our classes. I happened to go into an analytics class where we were teaching analysts how to query one of the databases and to do it properly, and how would you structure those queries in such a way that you get the information you want. It's more complicated than just how do you use SQL. It's tied in with what are the regulations you need to think about, what are you looking for, how do you properly scope. And one of the things that was shown across the board, an instructor started to type something in, and he missed something. He hadn't hit return, and he said, who can tell me what the mistake is that I made? And someone raised their hand, missed an end quote, and he said, so if I'd hit return, what would I need to do? And someone just immediately burst in, well, you'd fill out this form over here, and this is what you'd write it down, and here's who that form goes to say that you made a mistake, and you actually made a query that would have resulted in information being released to you that you didn't need for that particular question, because he was just doing it in a class. So the purpose wasn't there, even though he had the clearances, he had the right to the data, so just to be clear, he'd have had the right to the data, but not for that particular person. Need to know, but not at that particular moment for that particular reason. Because you restrict what you do in a class. It needs to be real, but you don't need to see everything. You can cut it back. And it just happened like that. They weren't doing that because the commandant was in the room. That just was a normal part of training. And that brought home to me how much the culture that I'm in cares about compliance. And that was an important lesson. So when I went back to research, I increased even more what we do. So research uses live data as well. So we also need to comply. We want to. And so we have a good set of rules. I really like what my predecessor put into place. I added one tweak to the process, which is that whenever we make a request for a particular type of data, if it falls into what we deem the sensitive category, which is lots of what the data is that you read about in the newspapers, that person has to brief me first as to the whys that they have, so that I know for any time that we're looking at sensitive data in research, there's a specific reason why we can't get away for that project with less sensitive data. And that's how much we care about it. And nobody objected. They said, oh, that's a great idea. I have no problem at all. And there's nobody, as busy as they are, who complains. Now, you'll hear people talk about the 18 hours of compliance training that we need to take if they're working it. That's not unusual. And add on to the regular mandatory training for those who are veterans of 20 years. Grumble, yes. So I'm not saying everyone loves the complexity. But what I am saying is that when you're looking at that environment, the compliance problem becomes, how can you help the willing do a better job of making sure they're getting the right data? How can you increase the usability of the system, which is something we're now investing in. I've got a researcher who's working on that pretty much full time. How do we make it easier for these systems to be complied with so that all the rules and regulations that the country wants, either current, future, are things that we can make it much, much harder to have a mistake in. And then you're down to dealing with just that small fraction that you worry about that might be attempting to misuse a system. And I would say if we've got one, it's vanishingly small. I think every population must have bad apples. So that's the other reason I want to bring that up. When you think about compliance, though, you need to keep that in mind for all pieces. You cannot rely just on the compliance of the willing. You should not also assume that everyone who's trying to comply is unwilling. So if you can balance those two things so that you make it easy for people to do the right thing and easy to catch those that are not, that to me is ideal. I rarely see that brought out in the compliance conversation. It tends to be more compliance is just a lower bar and we don't think much of it. In some situations, and that's really, in this case, this is the first time in my career I've run across that balance. It's so important. Here's another one I'll put out just very lightly because I did promise I wanted to give you lots of time for questions. Analytic process, high level. This is the classic analytic process. I am not convinced that this is the right model for cybersecurity. Actually, I'm convinced it's not the right model for cybersecurity, to be more firm. We've been using it this way for a long time in terms of a long-term threat. It works very nicely for certain kinds of attacks. It works, I love this slide. I believed in this slide. I've shown this slide as a proud owner of it. I borrowed it from with permission, former colleagues, and get a lot of mileage out of it. But I am convinced that of the future that this will slow us down too much. And we need to have a different style of processing and dealing with data, and that I think that we've actually moved a little organically in that level as well. So could use some research there. Sensors everywhere. I got this slide from NSF, so this isn't me picking sensors. We already talked about some of the people's social issues. Again, we need to think this through. As a community, an intelligence community, we have people that come in with embedded medical devices. So what are you going to do? Tell them not to come to work? Do we have to have a secure certificate from their doctor? So that's this is a tricky problem. Very tricky. Informatics, infrastructure, we talked about a lot of this. I wanted to pop this up partly to show you the legacy systems we have to deal with as well as the modern. Partly to give more kudos, again, to NSF for being gutsy enough to fund that Bluetooth car experiment a few years back. That was pretty good, taking over the car's brake system and turning them off with a graduate student in the car on an abandoned airport runway. I'm not sure I'd have funded that, and it was good work. I would have done it with adults. I mean, that worked for me, not graduate student contractors. I appreciate all of you graduate students. I don't want you hurt. So next sets of things here. I do want to say that in terms of especially the sharing debate, I'm a little concerned by a trend I'm seeing. I still have continued some of my external editorial activities. I'm seeing a lot of people, I think because we haven't got our head around the sharing problem yet, both proposing and doing research that does exactly the same kinds of things that they would be concerned if we did. So for instance, there was a project that sounded interesting that was intended to screen out robocalls, and their intent was to look at every call coming into a person's phone number and determine automatically whether or not that was a robocall or not. Well, that is something that I would not be able to do. And so as a research community, we might want to think about, is that something we want our students to do? Maybe the answer is yes. But maybe the answer is no. And so I think that in this area, there's been a lot of ongoing work. I know Doug Mon sponsored the Menlo report and so on out of DHS. So really good thinking about what should be the ethical standards for our profession. When is it acceptable to go around those? So for instance, military folks having different standards. Those that work for ourselves might have some different standards. What would you like for academia? So I just wanted to highlight that and then say this is an interesting area, and legacy doesn't go away. This is very cool, and this is something I want to highlight. This is the computer scientist in me is so delighted by the maker culture, this ability to pull from the outside and combine. This Fitbit that I'm wearing is a very low-tech level of that, where someone took a jewelry and added a Fitbit to it, so you get wearables. You get these really creative minds. You can go to libraries and places and check out motherboards and go use their 3D printer and come up with some truly wonderful, amazing things. That creativity is so important to our culture. How do we help it be secure? And at what point do we require people to be secure in working those technologies, at what age? Yeah, so that'll be an interesting one. This is a case where, again, the cybersecurity person in me is very concerned in a sense, because we could develop something that would be quite harmful if released, especially when we think about the DNA side, even more than the cyber side, perhaps. But in terms of the cultural change, this is wonderful and should be nurtured. So it's worth figuring out how we can make this as flexible as possible while still building in good habits. And perhaps universities and schools are the way to do that. This is something I wish I had saved a little more time for myself to talk about. The key piece to me in terms of cyber research nowadays is thinking through the full innovation cycle. So I talked a lot about how to think through long-term, short-term decisions and the trade-off. But particularly as ADA, we really need to think through what it means to be a learning organization, most of our organizations. How do you make sure that you've prepared the way for the technology? Are the courses ready? Are the people psychologically ready to pick up a technique? How do we make sure we can get it over the valley of death and on? And we need to think about it from the standpoint of the magnitude of the change. And this is a mistake that I think I made a lot of times earlier in my career. It's why I was disappointed that my first startup could only use a tiny piece of the research. It's because the world wasn't ready for the collaborative, cooperative intrusion detection stuff we were doing at that time. And I mean that they weren't ready in the sense they didn't want to buy it. Not that it was too wonderful. It was that, no, we don't want to buy that now. We want to have alerts all gathered together in one place. That we like. So that was good for the time, but thinking through the culture change that when you're having people do something disruptive and totally different that will cause them to have to let go of current behaviors and learn new ones, that's a really different kind of a culture change and a different kind of an innovation process and life cycle than you need if it's a researcher needs to work shoulder to shoulder with a mission element to make sure that they are designing a technology in a co-creation mode so that it will seamlessly fit into their environment. That second one you can do by putting people together in a lab, by inserting people in infusing the technology. Our forward deployment of researchers fits that mode. But a dramatic culture change sometimes needs to be nurtured off in a corner and only imposed over kicking and screaming from the top. You're not always going to get some of those dramatic changes that happen overnight. And we've seen that happen multiple times at the agency. So one of the things we're seeking to do ourselves is to think through what the culture change is that is associated with the technology, not just technology transition to somebody own it, because that will make it be more effective. And I won't say that we're there yet, but I don't know of anybody who's there yet on that one. Good area for research. This one, critical. We need to internally hire more diversity of perspective. The field needs more diversity of perspective. Deeply concerned by the turnoff of women in the field. When I was entering in, we were at the low end. There was a hump while I was a faculty member. It's now gone down, I think, very close. And I have not had the heart to look at those numbers very close to when I was a graduate student. Perhaps not so bad as that. Perhaps when I was an assistant professor. But this is key. We ourselves as an agency have to be more diverse, and I don't mean just gender and race. I mean age. I mean part of the country. If we don't value something, it's hard for us to protect it. And if we don't have different kinds of thought processes, it's hard for us to understand and defeat an adversary. It's just absolutely critical, the diversity of perspective. And that means investment in universities and support for what all of you do, because there's only so much I can do. Most of the good work here has to come in educational facilities, again, like CERIAS, where you start to bring people together. We do invest in a lot of these things, and we're going to expand that as well, because that's so key. And our director is highly supportive, so I think that you may see quite a bit out of NSA over the years here. And the education connection, I've mentioned a few times. I did want to highlight, for those of you who do work with clearances, we now have a journal that you can publish your classified results in up through TSSCI. I am so proud of that because that was, again, one of those not technically difficult to do. You figure out how to share the articles. They told me that could not be done. Well, we've now had 2 editions. A third one's coming out. Clapper wrote the intro to the 2nd edition. So the D&I for all of the intelligence community is behind this, that this is important. This is intended to put academic rigor behind classified research and allow sharing at whatever the appropriate level of tech is. So FOUO all the way up to TSSCI. I have not attempted compartments yet. I did want it to get off the ground. But you could, you could clearly apply this in compartments. It's sometimes tricky there to get a true peer review. You know, if it's a compartment of 5 people, and 2 of them wrote the article, one of them's a supervisor. It's a problem. So not perfect, but getting there. Here's just a map, not as dense as yours. These are the people who are willing to be acknowledged as some of our partners. There's a lot more. there's not everybody who's willing to be acknowledged there. And there's a lot we work with that are not listed because we're not currently funding a large amount at the point when this was originally made. But we do work across the country. The pictures are places that I think of as captive contractors in the sense that that site's pretty much wholly ours, but it is funded by ourselves and not staffed by Blue Badge federal employees. And again, shameless plug, you still have a little longer. You still have a little longer to nominate someone for our Best of Scientific Cybersecurity Paper Competition. Again, the hope with this is to highlight research that will help others understand what we value in terms of, it's mostly external, actually all external reviewers who make a recommendation. This year it will be to me as to what their best paper is, something that sets a good example for the field, so a way of highlighting and giving kudos to those that do the extra work. So please do take a look at that and nominate your paper. They do not have to be people that agree with NSA, and they do not have to be people that love us and say nice things afterwards. So as we've seen that, and that doesn't matter. The goodness of the work is what's important here. And with that, I'll end with my favorite slide. And I'll leave it open. I've got 15. See, this is cool. Now, how many of you first saw this going around as the most important security piece of that? Most of you did. How many of you think the coolness of the footprints was the most important bit? How many of you wondered about whether you could read that license plate? Who was looking at reflections in the mirror? It's a rich picture. You can take this a lot of places. But I love that one because that says if you put a barrier in place and it's nonsensical, people are going to go around. And also that sometimes you can figure that out. So with that, you've been a very polite audience. I still have left 15 minutes for questions, so I didn't do too badly. Please go ahead. And I don't know if anybody's capturing the notes, but I'd appreciate that if anybody who is capturing them wouldn't mind emailing them to me afterwards so that I can focus on the answer. It'd be wonderful. Thanks, Nick.
So I'm guessing even the NSA has limited budgets, and
Yes.
there's times you need to make decisions
Yes.
in regards to where you're going to make your big and not so big bets in the short and medium and long term. How do you guys make those calls based on, and who provides you the input of what the world might be like so that you can make the right calls to make the bets?
That's an excellent, excellent question. So I'll give you the longish answer because I think it's kind of interesting. In the big context, every year we get a classified document that comes from the ODNI, so at the top of the intelligence agencies, that talks about what they think the core areas will be in terms of hotspots over the next year. And the next few years sometimes. Harder to look out that 10-year time frame for me. So that document is beginning, and then we use internal assessments. We have internal people who do strategic planning. I have a team, a small team. I have to tell you, I'm not entirely satisfied with how we do our industry forecasting. We're very good at adversarial forecasting, so we understand that. The industry, we're going to step up our game in that area. So we look where people are likely to go. So for me, I look at problem space. Where is it going to be most impact, either near and long, because I have to look at both the current and the future. Can't use up all the seed corn on the current and can't afford to spend all of my time defending the future too far out, or that research emergency in the algorithm that doesn't get solved means that the adversary gets through, and then we might be done. And so all that comes in as information. I see that. My technology director sees that, and my TD, my technical lead sees that, my deputy sees that, and the heads of all of the groups that run the different organizations we talked about. And on a regular basis, we scrub. At budget season, which we've just gone through, we add several layers of assessment. So I'll set any strategic direction that I think needs to be set. The groups will get that. And then they'll come back to me with an assessment of their program. We did the first ever top to bottom, down to the group level scrub this year, by the way, in research. We've never gone that deep before, so I looked at everything. It was a stamina test. It was actually a lot of fun for me. But it was a stamina test. My team just about died. Week and a half, the first thing they did is they doubled the length of time that we put in it. Next year it will be a little less strenuous for all. But what I made people do is I made them write down, and each group chief working with their folks as to, and they knew this was important. What are those things, if I gave you more money this year or next, you would do? And what are the things that you would stop doing? And I made them use a pretty significant fraction of their budget. So no less than 10%, 10 to 20% are the usual numbers. And then I met with each one individually and said, well, so what if I canceled that program there, your least priority, and gave it to you over on the left? Why aren't you doing that right now? And sometimes the answer is, well, I never thought of that. Okay. I don't need to make all their decisions. So next year, I don't think I'll get any where they'll make that horse trade, so they'll do that as well. But that's how we do. And then so my budget, I know approximately what my budget is. There usually are cuts that come through. There sometimes are cuts because there's marks. Someone said, you've actually got to do this other thing that you haven't planned for. And by the way, it's an unfunded obligation, so run off and do. So I have to make the cut myself. Sometimes it comes from that process as we go through. Sometimes it'll be across the board. The agency has been wonderful about protecting research. We usually are not fair shared proportional cuts to the agency because we're valued. We get cuts, don't get me wrong. And then we constantly monitor my chief of staff. And we work the budget during the year. Are you spending on a rate? Can I collect some money from this and use it on another project? By the way, I need $1 million to do this other thing. What can we push to a little bit further to the left? So those kinds of conversations go on throughout. But for me, it's looking at that balance, and then it's looking at what we can actually accomplish and making sure I'm giving it to effective providers, making sure that the basic science is healthy as well as the midterm, as well as the near term, and then it becomes a bit of an art form, and you guess. My scorecard as director will really not be understood for another 10 years. Right? Yeah.
This is real quick, but please come on up.
There's only 10 more minutes. I've been too verbose.
So the other question is, do you ever get visits from operators that want to help you make those decisions, and I'll walk away?
I do. I often do that. More often I have to seek them out, but that's part of the conversation that I have throughout the year is to make sure that I understand what their priorities are. I'd like to say that something like 2/3 of the decisions I make are things that Mission will be happy with. 1/3 they're going to be furious about until they realize they desperately needed it. That's about right.
I'm Donald Steiner with Northrop Grumman. Would you mind commenting on the role contractors, whether small or large, play in supporting the research, especially along two dimensions? One is approximately how much of the research is actually carried out by NSA employees versus contractor employees, and also how can the contractors support the innovation in the transitioning the research, especially the applied research, to operations and product solutions and so on?
I'll do my best with that. Of course, dollars are always, and numbers are always secret level. So I'm going to wave my hands a little, but crucial. Most of our teams, even those that do the in-house research, are augmented by contractors. It's very helpful because my employees are here for life, essentially. So it's a little bit like your professoriate. If I switch direction, if the only people I had were those who work for me, if I need to switch research direction, I might be in a position of telling all my physicists they now have to become chemists. Not good, and it's not going to happen overnight. And usually the reason you need to make a pivot like that is that you've got an immediate urgency. The contractor workforce is crucial in helping us move rapidly in a technology-changing area, or in an area where you don't need to support full-time, or frankly in an area where I can't provide the right kind of environment to grow enough people that will maintain that stature. And I would say cognitive science being a good example. My body of colleagues for that individual is so much smaller than my pool of computer scientists and cybersecurity researchers and mathematicians. You can have great careers in those others, but I think that it would be too easy to lose track. And so we have to have more contractors in that area rather than less. So that's one of the balance points. The way that, and I guess it's hard for me to pinpoint the exact number of contractors because a lot of them are part-time. I want to say that in education, the factor was something like 10 to 1, 10 contractors to 1 employee. It's not as big as that in research because we're focused so much on our part of it. Technology director, again, much higher workforce in terms of contractors, again, really critical. In terms of how you can support better, we have a couple of ways. So sometimes you support by developing your technology on the outside so we can buy it, and I don't have to invest a person or dollars myself in it. The mission can buy it. I'm very happy about that. So that's wonderful. We're doing a better job, we're hoping, beginning this year in putting out unclassified problems. We had a bit of a brainstorm when the director asked us for questions they could give to Stanford students, and I told my folks to come up with questions that you would give to the top PhD students at Stanford, and I looked at the quality of the questions and thought, that's pretty cool. I like those. And we're going to try to make those sorts of things available on a regular basis through our research_partnership at nsa.gov, so that the notion would be if you want to look at whether you're industry or not, what are the sorts of things that if you asked an NSA or who's in math or computer science, what they would suggest to a top PhD student, you could take a look at what they would say. The mathematicians put in equations. It was very cute. I showed them to the director. He loved it. So that was fun. Did that answer what you needed? Okay, next.
Hi, my name is Corey Holzer. I'm
Hi, Corey.
a student here at Purdue.
Great.
I was curious to ask you, you talked about the great academic work that you're doing with the civilian academics. But what I'm curious is how much of the same kind of work or opportunities exist for the military that are trying to build their cyber force right now?
So the research is a little harder on the military side. We do have in research, I would say, fewer military folk than I would like, but I do have military deployed in, so it is a possibility. But we're not talking about it's not even 1% of my workforce for military. It's an area I've asked our CSS. You notice NSA CSS? CSS is the point of command for the forces that are deployed into the agency. For those that are not, and I wasn't used to this when I came to NSA, the military has to have the chain of command. So I've asked CSS if they could increase the number of billets that are assigned to NSA in hopes that they'll spend time with us. We also host the Director's Summer Program, so in that sense, we have people that come through and spend a tour in research. It's shorter, so the military folk that would be assigned would have an opportunity. We have begun to infuse a little more research into the education and training classes, making use of those former connections, and those bleed over a bit to the services. The issue we have with the more junior military folk, honestly, is on the military side, because what they tend to do is they have a very, as you know, a very strict progression. So adding even a half a day to a training class is really difficult. So what we need to do is get them deployed into us on tours to make that work. And we're doing our best, but it's the place I'd really love to see us do more. We're actively recruiting for former military, so that's a lot of people who work in research have some former military career. And we're actively seeking out Wounded Warrior Program veterans, because many of them are just outstanding in terms of what they know, and a retraining into research can be just exactly what they need to do, especially if they've got an injury that would make it difficult for a physically oriented job. So we're working that as well. You're welcome. Thank you for the question, and thank you for your service.
Hi, Bob Del Zoppo. I'm with SRC. We're a partner here of CERIAS, industry partner. Can you describe the relationship that you would have with organizations like IARPA and DARPA with regards to challenge problem interchange, and maybe just go with that?
Yeah, so my relationship with IARPA is very positive. I spoke with Peter Heinem Monday morning before I left coming out here, just dotting a couple of I's on things we want to work together. A lot of times what we'll do, Peter and I have begun these more regular conversations. I think we've got now 3 joint, 2 announced and 1 hopefully to be announced, projects where there's something that we're perhaps sharing some data or that we're leveraging it, one or the other. And so we've gotten as much stronger as we can. Lesser with DARPA. I'm beginning to know more people at DARPA, more of our peer groups, leadership in DARPA, but beginning with Peter with IARPA is really good. So that's been a good relationship. I do recommend, by the way, shameless plug on behalf of Peter, he is looking for program managers who will come out. He has got some outstanding programs that he's running, some of them with ourselves, some of them quite across the country. So if you don't mind living on the East Coast for a little while, and we're trying to figure out if we can leverage that a little bit more, but please do give him a call. So good man, and I think the relationship is growing well, and he would say the same. Thank you. Good question.
I'm just a little curious. I recently came from the inside to the outside, and one of the reasons that I ended up leaving was in the wake of the Manning and the Snowden attacks.
Yeah.
I went from being seen as a talent to be developed to a potential threat to be screened, watched, and mitigated.
You relate to my comment about the analysts and compliance, don't you?
I do. And I really, seeing the work that was done inside and seeing the need to continue it, especially to bring in, a younger workforce, a newer workforce that thinks a little more outside the box. How is the intelligence community in general working to try and still bring in that talent when automatically the people like me were suddenly seen as a threat?
It is a really hard process, and I think this is one of the reasons why I highlight compliance and the support of those who truly want to do it right as key for us, because we're losing people like you who don't like the restrictions. It was bad enough when we took away their tech, but when we started to treat them more suspiciously as people we have to force to comply with laws that they truly wish to comply with, that hurts our nation's defense. So we really need research there. So I will say that's one of the things we're doing, is that I'm highlighting it personally as an area that needs improvement. I know a number inside the agency are hoping that after we get through the first set of pressures from the outside, part of the difficulty is that, and I'll point to the elephant in the room, the agency has to regain the trust of the public. because the wish to push compliance doesn't come when you're perfectly happy and warm about a relationship. So that's something we have to do as senior leaders, is to get out there and talk more to the public, be as open as we can in hopes of relieving a little of that pressure, and then also with lawmakers. So there's that. On the more positive side, I would say the things we're doing right now in research should help in terms of more open environments, looking for ways where we can do more unclassified work so that there's less need to comply. If the data is less sensitive, then there is less pressure. So allowing more positive ways to interact, more like what you would get on a college campus. LAS is starting to pick up some of those characteristics, and I'm really pleased with that. And so anything that I instantiate with continued expansion here is going to have those characteristics as well. So those are the pieces. It's not going to be fast. We're going to lose some great ones, and it sounds like you might be one of those. So maybe you'll want to come back. Thank you. Good question. Am I down to just time for one more? Uh-oh.
It's up to you. It's up to you.
All right, I'll take a few more.
Hans Vargas with the State of Indiana. March 13, the Senate Intelligence Committee passed the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act. I just want to pick up your brain. How do you think that is supporting the mission of NSA, and how that bipartisan support from the Senate it could, how could play a role?
You are unfortunately tapping one of those areas I am very much bound to in terms of my answer, because we're executive branch and that's a congressional act, and it's not right for me to comment on those things. So let me say it a little different way, because what you want to get is my personal opinion about the sharing and the imposition, I think, more than a particular act, I hope.
Yes.
Yeah. Because I don't think we are allowed to have a public agency position on that. So for myself, so I'll have to word this very carefully to give you the most that I can. I see the threats that we are defending against, and I know that certain information sharing will make that easier. And things that will help those who voluntarily wish to share information, assuming that those that are involved really are volunteers, I'm happy about, almost always, with that caveat. So those things, in general, I like. I have deep concerns that as a nation, we have not wrestled with the hardest question, which is what I raised here, and that's who should and who should not impose sharing in any sense. Congress certainly is elected. We elect them ourselves. So in a sense, you could say that that is the voice of the nation, and if that is the voice of the nation, then my organization will use what they've given us in support of your freedoms and liberties, personal happiness. I'd like to be sure that we thoroughly understand the regulation that's been passed. I've pushed it about as far as I can. One of the changes when I became a federal servant is that limitation. I used to say I had tenure, and now I've had to learn diplomacy. So.
Hi, Eli Johnson, Raytheon. We're also a CERIAS partner, and I'm a certified cybersecurity and software assurance engineer. My question to you is supply chain risk management is a known problem, significant challenge, particularly in the area of FPGAs. Our dependency on dies produced overseas. We've lost some trusted foundries.
Changeovers recently, certainly, in terms of that whole activity.
So how are you ensuring that your research in this area is scalable to meet the challenge in the area of compliance with certification and accreditation paradigms for supply chain? Thank you.
So that's a very tricky problem. Also, I'll add to that materials. So those things that one needs to build from in order to supply. Do you have adequate supply of materials? Gets into personnel and water even in some cases also. So supply chain being one of the key tricky problems. So from a research perspective, in some sense, my issue is easier because I need to make sure that the devices and so on that we have are scrutinized well before we use them, and other materials that we might obtain are available. So some of our longer term research processes, I won't give you specifics, but there are things where we need to really think about. So do we really think we can get a this and a that and this other thing in a timely way? And if we can we get it in such a way that it's safe for us to use it? So that I have had more conversations, and I'm sorry I can't do more than that, but I have a lot of conversations where, can I really get 3 yada yadas in 5 years, and will they be safe for me to use? We do a little research ourselves into supply chain in terms of those things that are key for us, so there's a little bit of that. Not as strong. That's not an area that I've invested in directly to the extent that I think that you're discussing, mostly because we've tended to see that as a homeland security type lane, and we try to disambiguate when we can. It's not entirely. So when we need to understand supply chain for the national defense, that does fall into mission, and there are certain activities that they might or might not comment on in that lane. For myself, making sure that what we're doing is good. I'm not usually having to scale up beyond my particular agency, so in that sense it's easier. The changeover for the Trusted Foundry had to step back. Really had to think that one through. Fortunately, again, for my needs, we could say boutique in some cases. And in those cases, I have other options in terms of the development, but we did have to think that through very carefully as an agency. I've been briefed many times on the Trusted Foundry progress, even as deputy director, but certainly several times this year, as to what that truly means to the nation and to the Department of Defense, which is my larger concern. So I have it, looking at it from the outside, certainly something that would be a mission-appropriate thing to do. Investing in the research, not so much on our end. Certainly it's interesting and important. So if you work in that area, you're working at a good problem. Also, impossible to get completely right. Anything else, or shall I stop?
Anybody else?
I've already stolen another 5 minutes of your time, and I know you have some awards to give out.
We're good. Thank you so much for your time and for all the information.